Hello, doll friends. This is Michael Canadas with the Carmel Doll Shop and the Grovian Doll Museum. We are here today with our good friend Mary Senko that was kind enough to join us to give us a master class on Schoenhut dolls. Something very interesting happened to us that out of nowhere suddenly appeared a wonderful group of Schoenhut dolls. So we realized that although we've done a video with Mary before on Schoenhut, we need to revisit this wonderful topic. Now, it is an area that I know a little bit about. I'm not an expert like Mary. So you are going to be give me the master class on Schoenhut. So if I needed to know in 5 minutes or less the great things about this company, what would they be?
Well, first of all, Albert Schoenhut was an amazing person. He came from Germany at the age of 17. He immigrated to the United States, and he was actually sponsored by a Mr. John Dahl, who was a representative of Wanamaker Department Store.
Which is one of the
biggest ones that in that time in that Philadelphia area. He settled into the Germantown community, and he was apprenticed to work for Mr. Dreiser, I sometimes forget, it's a little bit of that dyslexic thing, with a D. In the piano business. John Dahl was importing pianos from Germany, and the percussion system of the piano was made of blown glass. That's sort of a problem when you're shipping it on ships and you're giving it to kids and they're pounding the keys and the glass was breaking. It was during the apprenticeship that Albert Schoenhut developed and patented pianos that had steel rods for the keys to be able to create the music. From there, he got married, started his family, and he moved into a small shop space in 1870 and started selling A. Schoenhut pianos, metrophones, and so forth.
And that was so popular.
It was extremely popular.
Because, you know, the families had to entertain themselves. So,
that's right.
So you train them with juvenile musical instruments, and then hopefully they can catch the bug and play.
It was pre-Victorian and Victorian period, and there was a lot of emphasis on music, the arts, beautification of the home, that sort of thing. But the part that's exciting is that within a very short amount of time, he moved into larger and larger spaces. And during the next 30 years, from 1872 to 1902, their line expanded into everything from costumes and tools that children could play with that represented policemen, represented firefighters, represented the military. Cavalry horses were created, and it's pretty exciting that in one of the doll houses were created. And one of the images that you've featured in some of your advertisements has been the large brew that's wearing the Schoenhut cavalry horse. They were very popular for children to play horsey and to romp around the yard with. In 1902, a big thing happened. Fritz Meineke, who was also a part of that Germantown family group that Schoenhut was involved with, came to Albert and said, look, I have this device. It is a elastic string.
Like doll string.
Like a doll stringing device. It was an elastic stringing device, and he had patented how to connect the animals with an elastic stringing device. And he wanted to sell it outright. Schoenhut, the businessman, always the innovator, always imaginative businessman, said, well, why would you just sell it to me outright when you could actually get royalties for it? And he said, I don't want royalties, I want to sell it outright.
But Mary, don't you think at that time the concept of royalties was probably a new
business,
a new way to do business?
Captains of industry could see that it was a coming trend. And from 1902, that string mechanism led to then the development of the Humpty Dumpty Circus, which was one of their biggest producing lines, which led them to issue the safari, African Safari in 1909, and it was the African Safari where the joint mechanism was created for the knees, the springs that created the elbows, knees, so that Theodore Roosevelt could shoot, could take pictures and so forth on the safari. What's exciting here with this doll collection is to see that that concept of this elastic string to the steel mechanism to the artistic development of the dolls, from the early period of the artists that were employed to later periods, and how Schoenhut built his company is pretty phenomenal. In 1909, Albert Schoenhut's company was the #1 toy manufacturing company worldwide.
All right. Well, that is absolutely fascinating. But should you now show me and teach me? I mean, since we've got all these wonderful tools in our tool chest.
That's right.
Let's go through them all.
Let's take a look at some of these dolls, and I can talk a little bit about the different periods and give collectors a sense of what to be looking for when they're out there and
then while they're
build
out
their
there
own
looking
collection.
for, as I know you've been collecting Schoenhut for a long time and been interested in a long time, do you think that today is the time to buy these?
Oh, absolutely.
Because I think we're having a generational change.
We have a generational change. Carol Corson, who wrote the Pink Encyclopedia, her collection is coming up soon. We have a lot of people that their collections are coming forward. This collection came forward.
It's a good time to buy.
If collectors are looking, this is a great time to get some special pieces.
Well, let's go look at some dolls.
Let's do it. As we started talking about a few minutes ago, and we're going to continue into, Albert Schoenhut's toy company in 1909 was growing exponentially. And by 1911, there was a tremendous ad that came out in Playthings magazine that featured just Albert Schoenhut with his hand kind of like this and saying, "He did it. He did it. We all knew he would do it." And he was advertising the beginnings of his doll feature. He had the circus, the Humpty Dumpty Circus. He had the African Safari with Teddy Roosevelt, which had created a tremendous amount of excitement in his toy line. And now he was going to introduce dolls. So what he did is he had an entire concept around dolls. He developed, with the help of his artist that he hired by the name of Graziano, he developed 4 carved head dolls that were girls, 4 carved head boys, and went on to develop wigged versions. But let's start with the carved head dolls with Graziano. By March of 1911, the dolls were featured in Playthings magazine, and we can see one of those dolls right here. We can see one of those dolls right here. And this is doll number 100. The girls were featured at 100 series. The boys were 200 series in the carved heads. So she's number 100. She's a very rare model of the period. And what's exciting about this doll, to see it in real life like this, most of us that are Schoenhut collectors have only seen her in Carol Corson's Encyclopedia of Schoenhut Doll Book or in Ann Coleman's Encyclopedia of Dolls. And this particular doll, you can see that she has a carved head that you can see the technique that Schoenhut was utilizing. He put a hot press mold, and the head had been turned, and then it was molded. It was pressed in a hot press mold.
And this is wood.
This is wood.
Isn't that amazing?
It's amazing. And they had a blur mark here. Right here was this blur mark on the head. And we can see there's not a lot of carving on the top of the head. They didn't emphasize that as much. And there was a joint that came up through the head, a loop that would hold the stringing and hold the doll's head on. And this blur mark was later on, we can see with this particular carved head boy, we see that loop that was in the top of the head and plastered and gessoed over, but we see that that blur mark of the head has been carved in, which is pretty phenomenal. But the original early ones had this blur.
So this is what you would, as a collector, you would know instantly this was an older.
It's older. This was an original right off the bat, first out of the frame, first out of the mold. And then probably midstream, we start seeing this carving, still 1911, where they're improving and they're doing this carved look. And another feature that tells us about the carved head dolls is that many of these dolls the original dolls had a very light painting of their face, and we can see that where they have a light painting of their face. Their eyes, the iris is outlined, the retina is a dark black, and then there's a little paint dot. And this was a big part of that, creating that lifelike, high quality image that would be appealing.
Mary, I see when I look at these, of course, I see this is really Cameron Reinhardt's Gretchen 101 with a molded bob hairstyle. So were they really in the early years kind of copying what was happening in the German character doll movement?
Albert Schoenhut was an innovator, and if you're going to bring something to the market, you're going to copy something that's already being done. And in this particular case, the Graziano artwork was a more mature looking mold and had a little bit of sadness to it, and it didn't necessarily have that K-Star R101 Marie look or K-Star R114 Gretchen look. But if we move over to, for example, these carved head versions right here, we can see more of a softer, unique look that was emerging.
I don't see a copy here. I see something unique.
We see something unique that was emerging. But if we look at this wigged version, which came not long after the carved versions, we see that this doll looks very much like the K-Star R114 Gretchen, very much like it. So they were doing things. This one also has that look, and it's kind of interesting on this particular doll how she has, again, a little more deep, sultry look in her face.
Pouty lips
And so forth. But Albert had hired Graziano. He was starting to build out the line, and he had brought his sons into the firm. He had 6 sons. He brought them into the firm, and one of the things that we had marketing specialists, and they had treasurers and presidents, all of them had a role. And the marketing specialist was looking at how some of these early, we go back to the Graziano doll, and the point here was, how did this doll sell in the market compared to how another doll was selling?
Right.
And they weren't getting the movement out of this doll that they wanted. So one of the traits about Albert Schoenhut that was pretty impressive in that early time is that he was very loyal to his employees. And he would keep people on for long periods of time and keep them working all year long. The toy industry was volatile, but Graziano had to go because his dolls weren't selling. So Graziano dolls, this period, this look.
Well, he was a designer. So
he was a designer. Yeah. He was an artist.
So it wasn't like he was.
He wasn't creating
he could go
something.
Create something. I mean, I think he created incredible works of art.
Right. But they weren't selling. So we got to have something that's going to sell. So the carved head versions changed, and we started getting a different look. And we have this lovely example right here. And you can see she has some of that facial feature of the 101 Marie. And she had the carved braids going down the side. And as we discussed, you can see where the blur is, where it's the mold came together right there, and they were carving that in. And these particular dolls, the ones that had braids, either had a blue braid in the back or they had a pink braid. And we have here today, we have two blue braided versions. So this one and this one right here, which they're both wonderful examples. And we see that the artists are doing the color of the iris, but they're not doing the outlining. So
And
that
I
was
think that's a very important feature to look for.
That was something to look for, is they're not doing the outlining, but they have, when you touch them, they have a nice detail to them. They still have a nice, you see the eyelid definition, we see the intaglio carving of the eye, and we see the eyeliner at the top on these dolls. We see more definition in this one with the pink band. We see high definition around her eyes. So they were putting a lot of effort into creating a very lifelike, emotive looking doll, appealing, something that would catch the attention of this child.
Now, Mary, I've just noticed something as we're filming this. This one, pale, this one, pinkish. So do we have different, stylistically, did we change our skin tones as time went by?
Yes. What happened was over the time from 1911 to about 1917, the paint colors were staying softer, paler. But in order to revitalize the line and create more sales, they brought out higher colored, more flesh-tony, brighter painted dolls.
Healthy kitties.
Kind of, yep, healthier kitties. Yep, that's right. Higher, and you can see. Look at the blushing on the cheeks of this doll. They also were doing more with doing the paint line through the mouth. They had, again, they were doing some carve out, but they ended up with more paint tone, but they weren't doing as much definition now. Okay, so you trade off.
Sure, you get one thing or the other.
You get one thing or the other. You trade off the emphasis in these dolls. So you can see the blur lines where the molds were pressed, and then where they would have carved in more, what they did with the earlier dolls, they're not doing that as much now, because we got to get her balanced again. Because now they're putting more effort into a more fleshy looking tone on her.
You can just lay her down.
Yeah, I'm having a little trouble. She sort of moved out of her stand. We don't want to let them fall.
She wants to embarrass us in front of the whole world.
That's right. When we talk about the painting too, I think this is a good example. The bonnet head doll is really highly sought after. It is a representation of the Heubach Stuart baby in the Schoenhut art.
Following a trend.
Following a trend. The Schoenhut wood, all wood. I love her little pin. Schoenhut would send the dolls out, all wood, perfection, art doll. And she was a magnificent piece of art. But I want to point out here, we see her little banged nose and her lip. Schoenhut on the early dolls, we have a little bit of color loss here at the top of her head too. In the early dolls, what Schoenhut was doing is he was lacquering the paint. So he lacquered the paint on, but he really didn't do an undercoat. So there was a couple of coats of paint, and then he would put in the colors and so forth. She has really nice, highly defined intaglio eyes, but she didn't have that undercoat. So when children were playing with them and they fell, which they invariably did, would get their little knocks. You know, they're playing. She has the chips on her nose, on her lip, and on her hair. And that is representative of an earlier doll. We look over here as we
Mary,
move down the line.
And Mary, as collectors, what I learned from having this exhibit here is that these dolls belong in their own group. Yes. And they look, even with a little battle scar, they look just fine. It's when you integrate them with a pretty bisque doll that you notice it. Don't you agree?
I do.
I think they really need to be in their own.
They kind of, you need
their own group.
That's right. It's fun.
So you have to have
that.
more than one.
Right. Well, when you're collecting, the emphasis was for us now is finding different examples. We look at Snickelfritz, and he's got a gessoed undertone to his paint.
So now
And
we're a little later.
A little bit later, but you can see he had a little bit of chipping, but that flesh colored gesso underpaint protected the overall face color. It didn't look as if he had so much loss,
Right.
color loss on his face. Where this, you notice her little nose
Right.
bump on the bonnet head doll.
Well, I'll still take 2.
Are you kidding? You got 50 in here, honey. Okay, so we're going to move along really quick now. And again, we have a highly defined, this is a wonderful example of the carved head, and we had these all tagged. I think this is model 201, so I think this is model 202 or 203. But
That
with
sounds about right, but
all the numbers,
it's hard to
hard to keep track sometimes. That's why having Carol Corson's encyclopedia makes a big difference.
Which she took that from the original source material.
Original source
So
material.
could you talk about how they numbered the dolls? Because I think it's kind of fascinating that they segregated them by sex.
Yes, the girls were 100 series, and we can see that with the Graziano doll as 100 series, and then the boys were the 200 series that were carved head. So carved head were 100 girls and 200 boys. Wigged girls were 300 series, and this is a lovely 306, and we can see how the intaglio look of the eyes are persisting and everything. Her coloration is great. She's an earlier version because she's pale. We see over here a carved head, a wigged head boy rather, and he's a 406. He's got some of that paint loss, but you can see
the gesso
there's
there.
a little bit of gesso under there, and this guy landed on his face a few times. You know, you can see
But
that.
I think he's got very unique eyebrows.
He has very unique eyebrows and eyes. His facial expression is really great. This particular doll
that's
is
pure character.
Pure character. He's wonderful. This character wigged version is a lovely girl. She's earlier. Again, you see the wood popping through from being played with, and then you see a later version in her class in her 300 series wig doll. This particular wig doll is the 301, and this particular wig doll, we seem to have lost her tag, but she is a 303. This particular one is a 303, and she has the teeth carved out and everything. She's very unusual. Most of the girls didn't have the teeth, but you can see earlier paint tone next to the higher color of a little bit later version.
But I think this is really interesting, Mary, because here we have this 303 with very feathered eyebrows, almost like the same painter as the boy, and then this with a single stroke brow. So is it just what the painter felt like doing?
Well, absolutely. Schoenhut had 2 blocks in Philadelphia that he filled, and the painters were at long tables, and each person
Gave
was
the
an
doll a
artist. They
personality.
did their little personality with the doll. So absolutely, you see some of the coloring. For example, the coloring of the eyes aren't as dramatic in the blue as they are in the brown.
I do love the brown
Yeah.
I mean, I love the blue too, but I love the brown.
Yeah. What we're looking at here is this model 303, and what you can see is that again some of these earlier versions that were coming out, so we're talking again about that 1911 to 1912 period where they hadn't really figured out too much about doing the gesso undercoat. And again, this doll not figuring out too much about the gesso undercoat, and the wood is popping through with this doll. So we move forward in the production of the Schoenhut dolls, and we see that the paint had it was a little bit thicker and deeper on these dolls, and this girl is moving away from the paler look to a little bit more coloration, She has a little ding on her nose, but it looks like she's been dropped a bunch of times because you can see a little bit of that gesso underneath.
Well, you can see she's a little imp.
Yeah,
she's a whole lot of trouble.
Yep, she is a darling girl. She's one of my favorites.
Mary, one thing we haven't talked about, we talked about all these wonderful character heads, but the one thing we haven't talked about is the amazing Schoenhut body. I mean, I think it's one of the greatest ever made for dolls. As far as playability.
Schoenhut, Albert Schoenhut, as an innovator, was just a tremendous observer of what was going on out there in the marketplace. And he wanted a doll that was going to be able to be moved about and had tremendous playability. He was watching his children and grandchildren, and he wanted to see them play. And we can see that they have these tremendous steel joints that provide flexibility. And when you think about this, and posability, and when you think about this, this is 1911, 12 on to 1935 when the firm closed. But you have a doll that is as tight
to 100
and
years.
She can 100 years later, she is as tight as the day she was made. There is no BIS doll that's been manufactured that can hold a pose like this.
And I think doll hospitals back then might have been really annoyed because no more stringing for them.
Yeah, no more stringing. And what I like is the amount of joints. You have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so 12 joints to give tremendous posability. She can stick her foot out, she can bend her toe, she can point her toes, she can do all kinds of things. And if this girl were standing on her stand and she was held, she is standing,
she can do it.
and she can hold her place, she can do all kinds of things. As we saw with our original 100 Graziano, our 100 Graziano can twist and turn. And Schoenhut saw an opportunity with this. He started marketing not only that these dolls were playthings, but they could be educational toys. They could be toys in the school to offer educational artist models. These dolls could be gym models to show how to do a jumping jack or whatever. So it was pretty impressive what he thought of as he was marketing his dolls. Again, it was that amazing innovation, imagination, and creativity that really pushed his company forward. Unfortunately, Albert Schoenhut passed away in February 3rd of 1912. And his sons were well poised to take over the company. Albert Jr. became the president, and Adolf Gustav became the treasurer. William was the head of, he was the head of engineering.
Just like old Germany.
Right, and Harry was leading the art division. And Harry is the one who said, Graziano's got to go, and he brought in Mr. Leslie, who was recommended by his son's teacher, school teacher. And Mr. Leslie actually was a big part of the change in focus of the dolls, the colorations, from more of a pale version to a brighter coloration.
And I'm noticing on this doll, which I just noticed it, our early dolls, they have their socks nailed into their bodies.
Right.
But this later one has this kind of funny little thing, like, you know, when your socks are too tight, it makes a wrinkle in your leg.
Right.
So what
was going on about? Well, the early versions, they had a nail that was nailed at the back of the leg, and it was a nail similar to this, but they found that children could catch their fingers on it
and hurt
themselves. So that was something that was immediately eliminated from the line. So just
putting that in a turn.
And they put a groove here and put it in a turn, formed it, and they would tie a string or a bow here on the sock.
Wouldn't it be great if all dolls had that?
Yeah, and it kept their socks up. And part of that was part of the era. It was part of teaching children to dress themselves, you know, socks up. Socks up, dress down, hair nice, and you go to school.
Okay, so so we've looked at some of the dolls from the first era. So can we have a peek at some of the ones from after Albert?
Albert passed away in 1872, in 1912. And so he was 63 years old.
The boys took over.
The boys took over. Mr. Leslie was leading the art department, and they were moving away. We talked about this, that by 1917, they were moving to a higher coloration of the dolls. And this is a model 310. And you can see again the differentiation between dolls that are painted by one artist and dolls that are painted by another artist. And they all had the same foundational touches. They had little fingernails painted on. They had beautiful intaglio eyes, but we look from...
There is a difference in this whole paint version, isn't
That's
there?
right. We look at this particular doll, and originally a lot of collectors thought that this doll had been touched up. You know, that when they saw a high color doll like this, Michael,
and big lips,
they thought
big
this
beautiful
doll,
lips,
big beautiful lips. She's a beautiful girl. They thought this doll had been touched up, when in all actuality, Carol Corson features this doll in her encyclopedia, that this is actually the correct look of that doll, the way it was manufactured for that time. So this would have been 1917 to 1924.
Okay.
And then we look again here, we have a model 301, which I do believe this model could potentially have been retouched with the way that she looks. But we go from this 301 that had carved teeth, which is unusual, but she has those beautiful intaglio eyes and multicolored hazel eyes on this girl. She doesn't have the blue or the brown, she has the hazel like me. And here's this girl that has the brown eyes, and you can see paler coloration, and now we're moving to that 1917 and on period where their coloration is becoming a higher color.
But would you, I'm going to make a statement. When I think of these dolls, I think, okay, Schoenhut is now they have their own personality, their own, they're not looking like anyone else, any other manufacturer. They are in their element.
They're in their prime.
Do you feel that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. By 1917, the boys were running the company. They had tons of great ideas, and they were innovators. They learned from their dad, and they were innovators. And we look at two dolls here, model 313. And this doll, she has a really pensive look, and we can see the multi-shading in her eyes here and the multi-stroke brows. She has a wonderful coloration. And I need to mention that Schoenhut was also manufacturing by 1912. They had divisions of sewers that were sewing the clothing.
And they're beautifully made.
We have some dolls here that are probably not factory, they're mommy made clothes, but we have a lot of dolls such as this one that looks very much like a factory piece, this garment. It's the sailor suit that was very dominant during that period for children to wear. We have kind of the eyelet lace dress that looks like it could have been a mommy made dress, very skillfully done. We have this one here that looks like it could have been factory with the trims and the extra details to it. So as we look at the dolls, none of them were tagged Schoenhut on the clothing, but you can tell as you handle the clothes and look at the dolls. And there's the catalogs that show the clothing. When the merchants were purchasing for their stores, they could now go in and they could say they wanted a size 16, in this case a 14 or 16, because Schoenhut added sizing changes to their line. Very important. They kept expanding, so they could have the size by a / the model 313, and this costume could have been a 500 or a 520 or whatever.
Okay.
So that's the way they were ordering. And then we see the 313, and then look at this 314. Look at how unusual this face is.
I think that's a fabulous doll.
This doll is wonderful. She has a wonderful, fabulous face. She has the mohair wig, and she just has that pensive, beautiful, little bit of an impy look to her, which is fantastic. Time went on, and they kept evolving, and we had the baby boom. World War I ended in 1918. Soldiers were coming back,
baby dolls
everywhere. And Schoenhut, just like everybody else, had their own baby doll. And we see the baby dolls here in a variety of sizes.
Very much like the Cameron Reinhardt Phillips.
Yep, that's
115.
115A or 116. They're kind of that same look. And then Schoenhut.
I think that's a very unusual thing, don't you?
This is really something that Schoenhut also created a mama doll. It was the cloth doll, and this was a little bit later. This was that 1920s, 1922 to 24. And they created this soft-bodied doll that was sittable. It was sittable, but it wasn't standable on its own. But just trying to expand their
stay in the game,
expand their line. And they issued the Dolly face doll, and we see Miss Dolly here, and we see Miss Dolly in a couple of sizes, the 17 and the 19-inch size. And we see Miss Dolly over here in a 14-inch size. And this is the sleep-eyed
and
doll.
You don't really notice at first that it looks like it's the decals of the others, but it is sleep-eyed.
Well, when you think about it, and this is important.
So, that had to be a lot of work to manufacture that too.
This was a difficult manufacture to be able to get the sleep-eyed, but let's face it, Germany was pounded into the ground with World War I, and they came back strong, as did France with their doll industry, and they were issuing, France had the SFBJs, and the high color look of the SFBJs and the high color look of the German dolls. They had the sleep eyes and Schoenhut.
And teeth.
So
they had to follow.
They had to follow. They had to stay with that trend. And they were looking for durability. The whole thing with the dolls started, funny enough, with Adolf Gustav's son, Gustav Gustav. Norman took the china head or the porcelain head dolls upstairs and was throwing them out the window, and they kept breaking. So a big advertising moment for the Schoenhut company was to present this unbreakable doll, which meant that a parent could buy one doll for their child and it would last the child's lifetime. And so this is why when we start looking at their catalogs and we look at their literature, we understand that the dolls were interacting. Schoenhut always featured the dolls interacting with each other in their catalogs, playing, holding things, doing things that were from the period. Felix and the cartoon items were becoming a part of it, expanding his circus line. Instead of having circus wagons, the line became milk trucks that were delivering milk, and fire trucks and all that.
Because everybody needed a milkman then.
Everybody needed all of it. So anyway, we expand on all the way. So as we look at these dolls, it's pretty exciting to see this many examples and to see the variations that are clearly in full focus when we're looking at these dolls. While we've been talking about the dolls and talking about the features, one of the things I would be remiss in not mentioning again is the important encyclopedic review that Carol Corson did in her book, which is often called the Pink Bible by Schoenhut collectors, to look at the different information, the stylings, the artistry of these dolls. A wise man once told me that in order to collect dolls, you have to learn to read first. So with that said, be on the lookout for these doll books and these dolls at some of our shows, the World Doll Day shows, or other shows that you might have in your area. The playability of the Schoenhut dolls makes them a great area to collect. And as Michael stated, you just can't have one. Having the animals, having the dolls interacting and playing together, picking up pianos, picking up some of the circus items to add to your collection just makes a fun display. And that's what collecting's all about. Have the fun, build a collection that you enjoy, and share it with your friends, and tell them to come out to the shows, especially the World Doll Day shows, participate.
And shop our virtual sales room, because you never know, there may be some
Schoenhuts right there. Make sure that you're checking in with the World Doll Day celebration, summer events celebrating World Doll Day, as well as our World Doll Day celebration Christmas extravaganza. Dealers are on the lookout for these dolls because their popularity is increasing. And we're thrilled that you could join us today for this program and allow me a chance to share some of my excitement about Albert Schoenhut, his innovation, his imagination and creativity, and encourage you to collect some Schoenhuts for your own enjoyment.
Thank you, Mary, so much for sharing with us your encyclopedia knowledge of Albert Schoenhut. Remember to like, subscribe, and hit that notification button.